Hey guys, I am Ben Drucker. I'm going to talk to you about building applications in the browser with Angular. I know it's a super popular technology, so we'll dive in a little bit. Quick 30-second sort of overview of me. This is my Twitter handle if you want to reach me. I work for Valet.io, a company that I founded that does fundraising for nonprofits. We help them use mobile technology to collect donations in the room at their big events. So we use Angular super heavily on the front end. I probably am like the single largest publisher of Angular modules at this point, and Node on the back end. So I do all JavaScript and all Angular on the front. So I want to quickly cover what exactly Angular is, because it's kind of in this nebulous spot where it's not quite a full-on framework the way maybe Ruby on Rails is, but it's still really useful. So it describes itself as a toolkit or a tool set, and ultimately that's not super useful for someone who's approaching it at the beginning. More crazy quotes from the founders of Angular. Basically, Angular is this sort of in-between bit that solves some of the hard problems in JavaScript and kind of gets out of your way for the rest of it. So what exactly are those problems? So Angular doesn't really get in your way when it comes to models. So there's no sort of active record-esque thing in Angular. Your models are plain old JavaScript objects. You can put together your own ORM and do all of that stuff if you want. If you want to just throw plain old object literals onto your scope, you can go do that. Angular really doesn't care. Template-wise, Angular uses this sort of crazy HTML syntax where you're not compiling handlebars or doing anything like that. It's HTML basically with its sort of own little extensions on it called directives, and those can sort of handle all kinds of behaviors declaratively from your actual markup that you'd normally be like diving into jQuery for. And the last is the chunk that basically glues 1 and 2 together, which is this $scope concept, and having sort of this hierarchy in your templates. So just quickly looking at what some simple Angular stuff might look like. We have all of these ng things around, which are directives, but then also some directives that don't have special prefixes. So required, for example, is actually sort of adding some special behavior that Angular deals with. So you sort of have to know what's going on. There's a lot of implicit sort of behaviors being added, but it can be really powerful. And then these double curly brace mustache expressions where we're just multiplying a quantity and a cost, running it through a filter. So this looks like HTML. It's easy to generate via something like Rails, and it's really simple to work with. We're not going to go too much into this, but directives are basically every crazy thing that you see in the HTML that's not plain old strict HTML, and you can do all kinds of stuff. It's very powerful and also very hard to grasp. So, and lastly, why Angular versus, let's say, doing jQuery? Like, if you're asking, why can't I just grab jQuery and listen on some click events, listen on some hover events, and deal with everything? When you're going one way, you have to listen for all these things, render your views, send them out, and that's fine when your application is tiny and does 1 or 2 little things. When your application does lots of things and gets very complicated, you really want this version to a data binding where you have lots of form fields and all kinds of complex logic. You want to be able to change a form field and have your actual object in JavaScript be updated and vice versa. And Angular's sort of toolkit, if you follow the way it goes, will do this all automatically for you with no special stuff. $scope you'll see a lot. It's worth reading up on if you want to know more. Basically, the way Angular does what I just talked about, sort of not having a set method, not having fancy things like that, but managing to update everything dynamically, happens via this $digest method, which basically runs through all of the stuff on your scope and sees if it's changed. If it's changed, it goes and updates the DOM. And so it's complicated internally, but you get to go build stuff right away that works and updates automatically and looks really cool, and you don't have to know really any of the details right off the bat. Lastly, Angular does have an abstraction for sort of data-oriented stuff that might be reused in different places. So they're called services. The terminology is very confusing, but you'll see these common built-in ones, $HTTP being a super common one that maps over XML HTTP request and makes it nice cross-browser and returns promises and does all kinds of nice stuff for you. And so you can inject those, and we'll look at that. So easiest way to demonstrate all this stuff is just to go start writing some code. Are we stopping for questions at any point from the chat? Okay, at the end. All right, so I'm going to install Angular using NPM, the Node Package Manager. If you want, you can download it off the website. You can use Bower, but you should do this if you're comfortable with NPM. And so we're just going to install it and then just get a little HTML file going here. Oopsies. To save it to the right directory. Okay. So one of the nice things about Angular is that you're not doing too much more other than dropping in a few script tags. So we'll also make our little application and get going here. So just creating a simple Angular application. And at the end of the body, we're just going to drop 2 script tags, one being our application, and actually before that, Angular itself. So, okay, close that tag. Save it up. Okay, and then within our actual application file, what we're going to do is Angular is a global, since we've included the script before. And we're going to create a new module, passing an empty array as the second argument without the empty array. People trip up on this a lot. If we just do this, you're basically saying there's already some module called LHD, go get it. So instead we want to create a new one, but we have no dependencies. And then we can just leave that there. All right. So let's just pop this open in the browser. And we can see that everything is loaded up. So we're actually going to add a little tag here that instantiates our application. And we're going to add a controller here as well. Okay, so both of these ng attributes are directives, so you don't really need to know precisely how they work, but Angular is actually parsing through this HTML document, looking for attributes that it's been told to look for, and then going to your code, finding the appropriate application, finding the appropriate controller, and setting it all up. So now we'll actually add this controller. And inject a scope. And pop a little message on there, and then display it in our body. So let me up the font size a little bit. So now we have something that we attach to the scope of this controller. That's now available sort of inside hierarchically below the particular HTML tag, the DOM node, where we added the ng controller directive, and we're grabbing this attribute. We can do many more interesting things though. So instead, let's drop an input tag in here. And we'll use the ng model directive, which will do two-way updating on some property on the scope. And so we'll call that name. And then we're going to change this around a little bit. So our greeting is hello, and then we'll say greeting name. And we're able to update that input in real time, see the changes reflected, and it's that easy. So we can do all kinds of complex things here. So if we add a little required attribute, you won't see anything meaningful here change, but we can very easily add something. So we're going to give this input a name. And actually wrap it in a proper form, which also has a name. And then we want to warn the user when this particular form has some invalid attribute, or actually the field itself. So you saw the ng prefix directives before, which are really obvious. There are other behaviors that deal with what seems like just plain old HTML that's not as obvious. So Angular inside your forms is actually going to parse through the names and publish the basically internal controllers for these inputs, for the elements rather, onto the scope. So we can actually go use this stuff. So I'll show you. So if we wanted to say, for example, here, we're going to use an ng show directive, which takes an expression and displays the element when the expression evaluates truthly and hides it when it evaluates falsely. So we only want to show this error message when nameForm.nameField invalid. I'm going to say here, oh no, you need a name. So we have an error message here, and then when I actually fill in my name, that portion is hidden automatically. So you can already start to see this is pretty simple behavior, but doing something like this with jQuery and having to listen on all of these key up events and things becoming unfocused and all kinds of crazy complexity would suddenly turn into a ton of code. It's not that there's no code here, it's just that Angular is dealing with all of these incredibly common patterns in HTML user interface design. Okay, so let's see, what else can we cover? So let's actually build up a slightly more complex form here. So I can actually grab an example from something that I worked on this morning, which is What we're going to do here is have a user enter their zip code, and we're going to go get the city and state that they're from. So I work on payment processing, and this is a super common mistake that people make in their interfaces. There's no point in collecting a city and state. You can get those from the zip code, and so let's actually look at what it would mean to go do those things automatically within Angular. So we'll call our form zip and get rid of all of this other stuff. And then we are going to have an input for our zip. And it's required. And then we're going to have a button that submits the form. We're going to call that lookup. Okay. And then what we can do is actually pass something to this directive called ng-submit, which will listen on the submit event for the form. That event is fired by somebody clicking on the button. That's just how the browser works. You don't have to worry about it. And then we're going to call something on our scope called lookup, which we will actually go code. Oh, we'll need to add them on. And actually, last thing before we continue, we don't want you to be able to click on the lookup button if you haven't put in a zip code. And so we're going to pass this ng disable directive, and it's going to be disabled when, let's just call it zip form, when zip form is invalid. And so we can just look at this. So we have a disabled button because the form's invalid. You'll see if I type in something, the button becomes enabled. Obviously, you would want to do some length filtering on that zip field, but let's go actually write some code to go look this up. So the service I'm going to be using is called Ziptastic. It's a super easy API here. So we'll just grab this little example. So in addition to a scope, we're going to need to inject the $HTTP service, and then we'll define our function here. Actually, just to make this easier on us, we specifically want to look up the zip. I'm going to put a result up here so we can set it later. Okay, so we just want to make a GET request and pop on our zip model, and when the response comes back, we're going to set scope.result to the response data. And should be good. And then below the form, we're just going to display our result. So we're going to look up my zip code, and there you go. So in a total of 10 lines of code, we're looking up a zip code using an HTTP service. This will even handle errors as well. So we could drop something on here and somehow deal with the error that comes back. So using next to no code, we have some super usable UI sugar. Okay. So I'll just delve in actually briefly how to sort of format some of this stuff more meaningfully. So a quick tag in here. And then we're going to use these double curly braces and say results.city. And we'll use the state as well. Oops, wrong tag. Okay. So again, looking up zip codes. Oops. Always fun to break something. Oh, would help if we name our variables properly. There you go. So yeah, every time you add the slightest bit of complexity, we can go back and look at what it would take to deal with this kind of thing using jQuery. So managing all kinds of templates, putting potentially IDs in these fields and all kinds of spans so that we can go insert the data later. Letting Angular do all of that for you is dramatically easier. And unlike an alternative, let's say Ember, this is very easy to get started with, but will also stick with you as you start to build large, complex applications that need a ton of testing. That's why I use it, and that's why I recommend it, because you can get started and then continue building your skills over time, but just build stuff even if it's a little wonky from the start. Just tell them, flag me at whatever point you want to start questions.
Cool. So, questions. And where are the best places to go for Angular resources for people who want to learn more?
The tutorials at thinkster.io are pretty good. I know people like the Scotch stuff as well. I would caution you against going too crazy using open source modules, or at least take a look at what you're getting into. There are lots of things. I'm somewhat biased because I've rebuilt a lot of these things myself, but for common tools, Stripe, stuff like that, that are really horribly written and will encourage you to use really terrible practices. So have at least some sense of like what's good and what's just going to get you sort of crossing off a feature, and at least make that decision when you're going to build something.
Are there any like prerequisites and things people should learn before learning Angular?
Yeah, I mean, you should definitely have solid familiarity with HTML, no question. It will eliminate the number of lines of JavaScript that you need to write by a whole lot, but I wouldn't say at all it's not like liquid, it's not a templating language. It's going to be a horribly painful experience if you can't write JavaScript. The point is to simplify the common things, to not have to be writing logic, show this when some condition is truthy, hide it when it's falsy. But ultimately, if you're writing a sizable application, anticipate writing like thousands of lines of code and thousands of tests to make sure it works.
Obviously, there's like a ton of choices these days in terms of like JavaScript frameworks. Mm-hmm. Like why Angular as opposed to some of the other ones, and like are there like so like if you find yourself using like a need for Rails, like there are certain types of Rails that makes the most sense. Like are there certain situations that Angular makes a lot of sense?
Yeah. So I think it's easier to say when Angular doesn't make sense, because there are very few cases when it doesn't, and I think people tend to overestimate how often their applications fall into that bucket. If you're dealing with large volumes of data changes and highly complex interfaces, maybe games sometimes fall into this category, or crazy stuff. React is worth looking at in that case. Everywhere else, React just isn't that mature yet. You're going to be spending a ton of time building things from scratch. It's also a much lighter weight tool, React is. So you're expected to compose lots of things. Angular still has that expectation, but gives you just a little bit more out of the box. Ultimately, if you're not comfortable sort of architecting large APIs from scratch, you really don't have any business using React. Angular will help you get over that hump, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good in the long run. It just happens that it's very usable for large applications as well, and that's why I feel like it's worth investing time, because it's not a tool, Rails, for example, that you might dump as you deal with something more sophisticated. With 90% of applications that you're building in the browser, unless it's crazy like amounts of data changing, you're just going to be able to stick with Angular pretty much forever.
Cool. Any closing thoughts or anything?
Um, yeah, try to read as much good code as you can. It can be harder with applications like this. Angular is still new enough. There's not a ton of open source Angular applications available the way that you might be able to find a decent number built in Rails. I have a lot on GitHub, probably at least a dozen like reusable components that you can go try if you want. But I mean, more importantly, like when I would distinguish between like the Google engineers who write about this stuff versus some random dude on the internet. You can probably trust like Thinkster and maybe Scotch, but something that's flexible, ultimately people have their own preferences and their own ideas about, and the fact is 80% of them are going to be wrong. So just be willing to be patient and refactor things a lot, because it's just a lot going on. It's a lot to manage. So you're going to get it wrong and have to fix it, and that's okay.